Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Melissa Gerson. I am the founder and clinical director of Columbus Park Center for Eating Disorders and also the founder of My Three Square, which is the platform we're on today. I'm excited to be here today with my special guest, Jen Medina. Jen is a registered dietitian, and she is the co-founder with Lisa Brown of Brown Medina Nutrition. Jen and I have had the opportunity to work together for a number of years, and Jen is really a leader in nutrition work, nutrition counseling in the eating disorder area. And so we're going to have a conversation today while we eat our lunch, and we're going to learn a bit more about how Jen works with her patients around their recovery needs. So just briefly, I want to share with you what the structure will be for the day if you didn't get the chance to tune in yesterday for our first installment. So we're going to start by reviewing meal components. So the structure today is going to replicate what we do in a treatment setting when we do a therapeutic meal. So the first thing we do is just check in around the meals that we brought to the table. And generally, we try to have very basic guidelines for putting together a balanced and adequate meal. We don't get too caught up in the detail. We don't look for any sort of perfection or accuracy in the meal. We use a bit of a looser format, and Jen and I are going to talk a bit more about that today. But we generally recommend that the meal that you bring to lunch support has a protein, carbohydrate, fat, and ideally fruit and vegetable if you can fit that in. So that it's balanced in that respect in terms of the nutrient components. So I'm going to review what I brought to the meal today. And so I'm going to tilt my screen so you can see my meal. Now, you know, I'm working with what we have in the house because it's a little bit of a strange time, as you all know. So you'll notice that I have a frozen meal, but it's really tasty. I've had these before. It's a shepherd's pie made by Blake. I think it's called Blake's Shepherd's Pie. I got it at Whole Foods. It goes in the freezer. I microwaved it for a few minutes. And it has beef and some corn and mashed potatoes in it. And I felt like that alone wouldn't be enough. I knew I'd be hungry. I'm coming into the meal pretty hungry. So I made myself a salad, like a mixed salad. And the salad has a couple of different vegetables in it. And it also has a salad dressing I made with olive oil and balsamic vinegar. And generally the guideline that we communicate around dressing a salad is that we try to put enough dressing on it so all leaves are covered, so that the dressing is well distributed throughout the salad. So that's what I did today. Jen, do you want to share your meal, and also, you know, anything that helped you choose?
Sure.
Like, just to be clear about that, you know, I chose my meal in part based on what I had around, and also based on my hunger level. Like, I feel pretty hungry today, so having the beef at my lunch today felt right given what I'm needing today. Right. So Jen, why don't you do your meal now?
Sure. Now tell me, I have a sandwich. Can you see?
Yeah, beautiful.
So it's with sourdough bread, turkey, some cheese, and a little avocado. And I'm feeling pretty hungry. You know, I'm going to have an orange after this. I didn't bring it over here because I was afraid it would get a little messy. But I'm quite hungry too. And, you know, I find the sourdough bread is really satisfying. You know, the cheese and the turkey, of course, are protein, cheese, and then avocado have some fat in it. And so it's a nice fuel. We call it a fuel mix, protein, carb, fat. Yeah. And that's what we like to see. All our clients, you know, whatever shape and size, we want them all to have a fuel mix.
Great. Yeah. So the way that we're going to structure the time coming up is that we're going to quickly set an intention. I'm going to share with you how we set an intention for the meal, and then I'm going to ask Jen a bunch of questions. We're going to have a conversation. While Jen and I are speaking, that's the time for all of you to eat your meal. I'm going to be eating throughout, so just don't hold it against me if food is coming out of my mouth or I have lettuce in my teeth. I realize a salad might be a little awkward, but I'm going to try to keep a steady pace so you can kind of use me as a guide if you'd like around pacing, if that's something that you're working on. And I'm going to also let you know when we're halfway through the meal portion. So we generally look at the meal as about a 30-minute period to complete the meal. Many people have a hard time completing a meal within a certain specified time range. So that's something that we like to work on. And 30 minutes, we feel, is a decent amount of time to be able to finish a lunch meal. So I'm going to be eating while we're talking. You can watch my pacing. I'm going to let you know when we're 15 minutes in. And then I'm also going to let you know when we have 5 more minutes left to complete the meal. What I also want to do now is set an intention for the meal. So this is something we always do in a treatment setting. Or at least in our treatment setting, we want to kind of go into the meal with an idea of what we want to accomplish. And it's an opportunity to think about something that you might want to be working on during that meal. So people will say things like, I'm trying a challenge food today, so I'm really working on just getting through that. People might say, I'm doing something different with my food at lunch today. I'm trying something just a little bit different, and that tends to cause some anxiety for me, so I'm going to try to get through that. A lot of people will talk about trying to control worry thoughts by staying engaged in the conversation. And so hopefully we'll offer an engaging conversation that you can attend to while you're eating your meal. So that might be something that an intention that you want to set for yourself. All along while we're doing these meals, we're going to also be teaching different skills. So you can decide if you want to work on a particular skill today. It might be opposite action, or it might be a mindfulness-based skill. You're going to be learning more through this network of skills that we're offering. But if there are skills that you've practiced in the past that you want to implement today, that would be a good intention as well. So let's go ahead and start eating. I'm going to set a little timer so I know when we're about halfway through the meal. And I'm going to ask you some questions, Jen. So I guess the first question I would have for you is, maybe some of our viewers have worked with dietitians before, some may not have. Where do you usually start? So let's from the understanding that someone may be coming to you the first time seeing a dietitian, struggling with some form of disordered eating.
Yeah.
Tell me how you begin the work and how you begin to engage that client so that you can start being productive together.
Sure. I mean, I always want to know where the client is. I mean, actually, before they even come in, we have them write down in free form, what they hope to get out of the session. And then I always say, now that we're face to face, is there anything more you'd like to ask me or add to this? And if they feel like they've said it all at the get-go, then, what I'm going to tell them is, first of all, the fact that I'm a dietitian, I'm less judgmental of what they're eating than the average person. I'm not the food police, and I want to meet them wherever they are at and then help them move forward from there. My job is to push, but their job is to tell me if I'm pushing too hard. Mm-hmm. So, I want to know, I always say, I want to know that when you walk out my door, that you have, you may be feeling a little anxious, but I want you to feel like you have a good chance of having some success this week.
So it sounds like, it's gradual. It's gradual process. You're not starting with an overhaul of somebody's eating behavior. You're really starting with small steps. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's totally non-judgmental. And actually, I always let the person know too that it's an anti-diet philosophy, and it's a philosophy that there are no bad foods. It's all.
Tell us more about that, because I think people may have heard this anti-diet or non-diet approach. Mm-hmm. Can you share really what that means?
Sure. So again, there's no, there's no bad foods. Now, here's the thing, it may also involve more of an intuitive eating approach. And what I mean by that is that, you're eating when you're hungry, eating what you're hungry for, and stop when you're comfortably full. However, if you are in the process of recovery from either anorexia, or binge eating disorder, bulimia, your hunger cues may be totally off. And so it's not the time yet to be eating intuitively. You know, you're going to need guidance, really from a nutritionist, from a dietitian, to help, to give you structure to your eating, and to help you know kind of when to stop, you know, and how much is enough initially. And it's not like I'm in your stomach or in your brain, but doing this for so long, I have a good sense. And it's not just that, also based on all the information you may have given me, I'll know how much you need, you know, to be well fed, but not overfed.
I think that's a really good point. You know, people talk a lot about intuitive eating, and I think what's really important to remember is that at the beginning of the process, it's impossible to eat intuitively because
Absolutely.
there are so many disordered thoughts. The eating disorder voice is so loud
That's
that
right.
that robs you of any ability really early on
Right.
of being able to say, am I hungry? Am I feeling full? What do I really want? There's so many rules that come up. There's so many
Right.
like judgments that come up that
Mhm.
really make it almost impossible to connect with intuition. So oftentimes at the beginning, it's a really nice partnership when you're working with a therapist and a dietitian, because you can come up with almost like a prescription, and it may
That's right.
even almost be robotic at the beginning, where
Yeah.
you're grounded in your breakfast, your lunch, your dinner, your snacks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Um, yeah. So,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, no, that's okay. Yeah.
Curious about how you work. So some people will say, you know, when I feel like I don't know how much to eat, but when I start to measure my food, I get in my head. You know, I start to get anxious. I get really fixated on the quantities, and
Mhm. Mhm.
I get very rigid about, is it right? Is it wrong? How do you
Right.
kind of work in a more of a prescription manner? So not in an intuitive
Right.
manner, but also without stirring up more anxiety or more
That's right.
focus on
So,
rigidity. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, no, and it's tricky. It's a fine line because in the beginning, you know, in order to overcome the disorder, you do have to think about that. It takes a certain amount of focus and thought, and with amounts, you know, I'll often say, okay, a tennis ball amount of starch, you know, like grain, or a fist size of something, you know, or you know, the amount of, let's say, you know, 2 dice of butter, you know, so because I don't want the person to go home and start measuring their life away. I mean, it depends on the person. You know, some people say, look, I'll be okay if I can just measure once and eyeball thereafter.
Mhm.
Then please just tell me, you know, give me a more exact amount. And I can do that for sure, but I tend not to, because it can get very, very obsessive.
Yeah, and
Yeah. One thing I wanted to say
it-
before.
it's really a sign of,
Ooh,
I think, the recovery
hang on.
process really taking over when someone can begin to eyeball. When you can, go into the granola, take a handful of granola, put it on top of your yogurt,
Yeah,
and that's okay. That's how you know.
right.
Or, you know,
Sure.
when we select our meals here, I won't measure my pasta. I
Yeah,
put the pasta in the bowl, and I have a sense of, well, that's usually kind of the amount of pasta that I eat. So
that's right.
you begin to get more comfortable with your own judgment, and you increase your trust in yourself over time.
That's right.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And also, you know, getting back to the whole hunger and fullness and intuitive eating, in addition to the noise in one's head, you know, at the beginning of recovery where there's just too many rules and there's just too much noise, it's also physiologically, you know, your body, for instance, with anorexia, I mean, the body, the hunger and fullness cues have acclimated to a body that is underweight. It's accustomed to too little food. So if you are then eating in accordance with hunger and fullness, you're never going to weight restore.
Such a great point. Absolutely. So in a way, you have to guide your patients to
And
actually not pay attention to hunger and
correct.
yeah,
Correct.
override those cues.
Correct. So, and for that reason, you also hear a lot about mindful eating.
Mhm.
We don't, right now, we want you to listen to
No
Melissa,
mindful. Yeah.
and me. We don't want you getting into every little thought and feeling
Yeah.
about your food. We want you to be distracted right now so you can
Definitely.
get through your meal. Right.
Which is the funniest thing, because you would think that the foundation of recovery would be mindfulness, mindful eating. We hear about mindful eating all the time. But I mean, in a way, what we're doing right now, we're trying to distract our listeners from their food. We
Right.
want you to attend enough to pace yourself and eat your meal, but listen to what we're talking about so you can be distracted from the thoughts that might get in the way. So
That's right. And it's not until the person is, if they're anorexic, it's not until their weight restored, or if they're bulimic, it's not until they've stopped binging and purging, that then we get into more focused intuitive
yeah,
eating.
yeah.
Right.
That's kind of part of the graduation ceremony.
That's right. It
Yeah.
is. That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just one other point that you kind of reminded me of, especially with anorexia, but it also can happen with bulimia, that the whole GI system acclimates to irregular eating,
Correct.
and so what ends up happening is there's delayed gastric emptying. There are
Correct.
changes in the way that our bodies process the food and digest the food. So oftentimes people will say, when I eat, I feel so full, it sits in my stomach, I feel the pressure, I feel bloating, and that can be very real. And the way we work through that, right, is to keep going. Like, unfortunately, you have to just kind of ride.
You have to keep
Yeah.
going and understand that it's not just you, that everyone across the board. I don't think I've ever worked with someone who didn't feel it, because it has to do with the slowed down metabolism. When you undereat, your metabolism temporarily slows down. It's a way to keep you alive, and it's a way to conserve energy. And so as the metabolism slows down, all of digestion slows down. So the emptying of the food from your stomach to your intestine slows down. The emptying of food to have a bowel movement. Sorry, we're eating.
Yeah, no.
That slows down too.
Yeah.
But so how do you reverse that? You eat.
Mm-hmm.
And you eat, obviously not to the point where you're sick, but you know what? You do push past the point of comfort. You eat past the point of really a little bit of physical comfort.
Yeah.
But that goes away, and before you know it, people come in feeling their GI, they're feeling better. They're brighter, they have more energy, they're thinking more clearly. And it's like, oh yeah, no, I'm not feeling any of that anymore.
Yeah, you really do
It's
see
wonderful to
that
see.
feeling. It's amazing.
Yeah.
I want to bring something up about those in our audience who might be saying, "What, are you kidding? I never feel full. Like, I never feel full." Like, so maybe people who might struggle more with binge eating or emotional eating, or with bulimia sometimes as well, that feeling like I don't really know when I'm hungry, and I don't really know when I'm full.
Yeah.
And can you speak to that? What
Sure.
is it about the eating disorder that kind of gets someone to that place where they can really, really not experience those cues? Like, there is no real connection with hunger and fullness. And
Right.
and thinking about it more from the perspective of someone who might be a binge eater or an emotional eater, or somebody who's had a lot of dieting experience where they're not really,
That's right.
they're kind of taught not to listen to their cues and instead follow a diet plan.
That's right.
Yeah.
Certainly, dieting is a huge trigger, of course, to binge eating. Because of the feeling of deprivation, the feeling of scarcity, like there's not going to be more food around the corner. And diets also cut people off from their hunger and fullness cues, because you're eating according to either macronutrient, recommendations, like you count your carbs, or count your macros, or calorie counting. Don't go above a certain calorie level. So then you're never even thinking about hunger and
You're
fullness.
taught not to listen to your body.
You're
You're
taught
to override your
you're
body.
taught that, you're taught that you can't trust your body, and that you have to use external cues to tell you when to eat and when to stop. So, okay, so then that feeling like, you're not going to get, that the food is bad, or that you're not allowed to eat a certain food, then can set up a desire to, of course, have the food. It's the forbidden fruit. And then if you feel like you're messing up, you're feeling like you're screwing up because, heaven forbid, you're eating that food, oftentimes just the anxiety can become so great that you say, forget it, I'm just going to binge, I'm just going to go crazy. And oftentimes the only time people give themselves permission to eat certain foods is if they binge on it. And so for that reason, I often try to legalize binge foods and actually incorporate them into a normal meal plan. And so here's the thing, and this may sound almost kind of, for lack of a better word, diety, but for someone who's binge eating, especially binge, kind of compulsively grazing throughout the day and eating whatever, whenever, I'll sometimes ask them to, at the beginning of the day, set approximate times for meals and snacks. But I'm not as concerned about what that food is. I'd like to see them incorporating all kinds of foods, and incorporating their binge foods, but not overeating them, not binging on them, eating them within the structure of 3 meals and 3 snacks.
How do you work with, when you said that, it brought to mind how so many people have such fear about bringing in the food, incorporating the food that they fear they're going to binge on. And it's not just people who struggle with binge eating disorder. What you'll see with anorexia is there's such a fear of loosening just a little bit, of loosening your rules just a little bit, because, okay, we're about halfway through, 15 minutes in, I'll let you guys know when we have 5 more minutes of the meal time. But I think there's, in anorexia too, in both, there's so many similarities across all of these diagnoses, but, there's such a fear that if you let go a little, it's going to open the floodgate.
That's right.
That very black and white thinking, like if I just let that one food in, or if I don't stay rigid to what I know is safe, it's just gonna, the floodgates will open and it'll be over for me. And so I'm curious about how you work with that in the nutrition setting. How do you take that leap from I'm too afraid, I can't do it, to I'm gonna give it a try, I'm gonna take a leap of faith and allow myself.
Yeah. Well, certainly I work very gradually. Look, sometimes I'll do what we're doing now, and we'll introduce that food in my office.
So
and
exposure,
we'll start,
like an exposure
and we'll start there. And in general, it's a very slow process. Like we might start with a certain, let's say starches or complex carbs. We'll start with maybe a starch that is they're a little less fearful of. And we'll build up to a normal portion. And then we'll move on to, I don't even want to say a food, because I don't want to say a specific food, because I don't want to give anybody the impression like that there's anything wrong with any of these. But so we'll move on to the next, the next.
Kind of like chaining, like you're kind of chaining. You're starting with something that feels maybe safe, but just a little bit anxiety provoking. And then once you kind of conquer that level, you might move on to the next thing. And so you're kind of chaining, like, if let's say you're afraid of pizza, you might start with just the cheese component and kind of conquer that element of it, and then integrate the sauce and something else that you're eating, and like get more comfortable with the bread, and sort of work your way up to something that might be too frightening.
And of course, I know you're going to actually well, time permitting, you may talk about the starvation studies, but
Uh-huh.
you know, what we know is that sure, starvation can increase a sense of extreme deprivation, deprivation, and
Mhm.
you want the food that much more. But once, the thing of it is once your weight restored and you're eating enough food, there's just there's less of a sense of deprivation, and it's kind of a catch-22. But in order to not have that feeling like you want to just go crazy on that food, um, I mean, you need to eat enough of everything, and you need to get your weight up to whatever is deemed a healthy place by your dietitian, by your doctor.
Well, it's sort of like we like to think about it as that sort of evolutionary survival model that, if your body is not getting what it needs consistently, and if your weight is suppressed and really your body is telling your brain something's not right, I'm not getting consistent nutrition, I'm not getting enough nutrition. It's sort of natural then from a survival perspective to think that you're just going to be focused on food.
Mhm.
Think about an animal in the wild who, is there's a famine in the land and that animal in its current habitat is not getting what it needs. Well, of course, the brain is going to be primed to get that animal fed. And so the
Right.
animal is going to have plenty of energy to motivate to move to another territory where there's food. And so the animal will
Mhm.
stay completely and wholly focused on food. And so that we see that all the time in with our patients because
Mhm.
they come to us having been on diets over and over again or underweight or in maybe even in a totally healthy BMI but weight suppressed for them, like their
That's
body
correct.
needs to be at a higher
Right.
weight, and so their brains are actually really responding to the threat to the system.
Yes.
And so a lot of times what really has to happen first is that there needs to be regular nutrition to
Mhm.
send those messages to the brain that your body is safe now and you
Yeah.
can actually focus on some other things, not just
Yes.
food.
And that's such an important point,
Yeah.
about also, you know, having, I'm not sure exactly how you worded it, but maybe your BMI is quote unquote within a healthy range, but it may not be healthy for you, and you may
Yeah.
actually be trying to achieve a weight that is genetically is too low for you. And I've seen more. And I currently have clients who, I mean, just are starving. I mean, they are as they really are as eating disordered and anorexic as someone who is
With an
extremely
emaciated frame. Yeah.
emaciated,
Yeah.
emaciated. And what's and I want to stress that because these clients find it hard to have compassion for themselves. They think, oh well, I'm not sick enough, and what's wrong with me, and they're starving themselves
Yeah.
even though their BMIs are normal.
Yeah. So we call that, for people out there, we call that atypical anorexia. It's called atypical
Correct.
anorexia, and it is
Right.
anorexia because that individual is not taking in enough nutrition regularly to sustain a healthy weight for them. And
And
that
I have
there's
to say,
a suppression of weight. Yeah.
I wish it wasn't called atypical,
Right.
because
Yeah.
I feel like I'm seeing more and more people like this.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I would say it's a pretty big percentage of our population, actually.
Yeah,
Patients that might fall within, a relatively healthy BMI, but
that's
are
right.
without question weight suppressed from periods of time of dieting behavior, restrictive behavior.
Hmm.
Um, I'm so curious to hear from you.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest myths that come up with
Oh
people
God.
who come to see you? Because every day you hear another thing, don't eat gluten or don't eat carbs or don't, vegan is the way to go. And so for our audience, is there any way you can speak to maybe even just a few of those beliefs?
Sure.
So for example, gluten is sort of a funny thing. I find it kind of funny because there are people with real serious gluten intolerance,
That's
is
correct.
celiac, but otherwise, I think that a lot of times people will have a totally normal body response to gluten, but maybe restrict it because it just feels good to have something to restrict,
To
to have
restrict. Oh, that's for
like,
sure. The majority of people do not need to go gluten-free. It's really a small percentage of the population that needs to go gluten-free. And when I say needs, I mean, you've got celiac, which is an autoimmune disease where the body basically attacks itself if the person eats gluten. I mean, they can't have even a microscopic amount of gluten. You do have some people where their gastroenterologist will diagnose them with gluten intolerance, which is a different thing. But I have more clients coming in saying, oh, well, I don't eat gluten and I can't eat it. And I really question it, because I think it's yet another way to cut out a food group and restrict calories.
I think sometimes people feel that feels comfortable in some ways to be able to have this concrete thing that you are going to avoid, that can make you feel like a sense of organization or calm.
That's right.
I'm not going to eat gluten. And then every time you don't eat gluten, you sort of feel better. Like you feel better psychologically. You feel like, well, you accomplished what you set out to accomplish. You
That's
have
right.
a rule that you followed. And so it ends up being very reinforcing.
That's right.
At the end of the day, sometimes I know I've had this conversation before, is this really about your health? Because if it's really about your health, I mean, there's no real reason to restrict gluten. And is this really much more about just feeling like a sense of organization or calm and excluding something
control
from your diet, a sense of control? Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a lot of what it's about.
Yeah.
I have clients who come in and they've gone everything free, gluten free, this free, that free, and so much of it is about control.
Yeah. Yeah. Now tell us a little bit about carbs, because
oh boy, I have this conversation almost every day. And look, the top weight management researchers will tell, and I actually worked for one of them earlier in my career, and they will tell you it's that weight management, weight maintenance, weight control is not that carbs alone don't make people gain weight.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Five more minutes for the eating portion.
You got it. Oh, I need to eat my sandwich.
No, you can eat a little bit when I do when I speak at the end.
And the biggest myth, I mean, so many people are bread phobic. I made a point of eating this sandwich today because personally I love bread, and I understand. I mean, a big baguette, or a big loaf of Italian bread. I mean, if you're eating huge portions, it's one thing, but having some slices of bread or a couple slices of bread for your sandwich, that's not, let's put it this way. I also, believe it or not, work with people who can be considered overweight, and they come to me and they want help with weight management, and I will put bread on their meal plans.
Yeah.
Absolutely, positively.
Yeah.
And they all do great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what we notice for people who struggle with overeating or binge eating, oftentimes what we find is they're overeating on carbohydrates.
Yeah.
But generally, they tend to feel a lot of guilt around
absolutely
carbohydrate, or they don't allow carbohydrates, or they maybe allow them, but they feel bad about it every time they do it. And so that builds up a certain tension. So oftentimes when there is an episode of binge eating, it's usually the thing that is the most kind of emotional for that individual, the foods that are the most conflicted.
That's right.
Yeah.
No, so true. And so I try to get bread, pasta, all of that back into
Yeah.
my clients', repertoire.
Now, what about this whole vegan movement that we hear so much about? What are your thoughts about vegan in terms of, is there some element of, health benefit to it? What do you see when people come to you on a vegan diet? Do you tend to try to dismantle that? How do you generally approach veganism?
Look, it's tricky. I mean, I've had certainly plenty of teenagers with eating disorders who want to go vegan. And what we generally say is you need to be recovered and weight restored and wait till for at least a year. And we want you to wait till you're about 18, till you're an adult to make that decision. But you've got to be well recovered, because we want to be sure that the veganism is not yet another way to restrict food, to restrict food groups.
Yeah.
I've had adults come to me who are vegan and eating disordered, and I know some of the residential eating disorder programs now are trying to cater to some of the
to accommodate veganism.
Not
so
a cater,
rule
but
out.
accommodate. So if an adult comes to me and they're vegan, and absolutely insist, then I'm going to do my best to work with them. But it's hard because there's just a lot of restrictions.
Yeah. There's certainly that social impact too, that if you're vegan and your friends are not vegan, it's a little bit harder to manage.
It's very difficult. Yeah. Traveling gets difficult. My one client went traveling with her family, and it was very hard. None of them they're not even vegetarian, and it was very difficult to manage. So to be healthy, and I'm not basing this on any personal bias, personal opinion. This is based on research. You don't have to be, healthy. You don't have to be vegan. There's a lot of healthy components, please, legumes, whole grain. Well, actually, you can be a vegan and not be eating whole grains. It's not always healthy. You really need to know what you're doing to be a healthy vegan.
And I think bringing up the word healthy is a nice opportunity, to talk about what that really means, because oftentimes we have to really remember that being healthy means that you can eat in a variety of different settings. You can go out to eat in a restaurant. You can go to somebody's house and have a meal that's served to you. You can eat in a social context. So we're at 30 minutes for the meal. But being healthy means that there's some flexibility for you to be able to live your life.
That's for sure. And healthy also means healthy for you. Again, I have these young teens coming in saying, well, I eat healthy. I eat the way my 55-year-old mom eats.
Right.
Well, the needs of a 55-year-old and a 14-year-old are hugely different. And what's healthy maybe for mom is not healthy for that 14-year-old.
Absolutely. I feel like we could keep talking forever.
I could go on forever about this.
That we didn't get to, but we'll have you come back, and we have much more to cover. So, Jen, you can get to your lunch. I'm sure
I'm going to eat.
Yeah, you're hungry. So I completed my meal. You guys can see, and I managed to do it without getting lettuce stuck in my teeth, which made me very happy. Although I can't really tell. I don't think I have lettuce in my teeth. Anyway. I would say I finished probably in about 20 minutes, but I would say I'm a faster eater maybe than average. For those of you that didn't get to complete your meal, you can keep eating as we continue talking. But what I would say is that pacing might be something that's worth working on for you, because it'd be great to be able to complete your meal within a 30-minute time frame. And what we find often is that with eating disorders, one of the kind of symptoms of an eating disorder can be extended eating. It can be cutting up your food in smaller pieces, taking a lot of sips of water in between bites, or just extending the meal for long periods. And so generally we look at that as a target of treatment, that we're going to try to reduce those behaviors so that you can complete within a reasonable time frame. And the way that we work on that generally is we try to, if you decide you want to join us another day, maybe try to match my pacing. Maybe an intention you might set for a meal would be that you're going to listen to the conversation, but you're also going to really try to match my pacing around the bites. And maybe you won't be able to quite keep up, but to kind of do your best to try to speed up the pace of the eating. What I'd like to do now is share something that Jen alluded to, which I think is just an interesting concept for everybody to understand. And it's a concept that I often introduce very early on in treatment. And so I figured it might be a good thing for our community to understand today. And some of you may know this already, but it's such a fascinating concept. So I'm going to start basically what I'm talking about is the effects of starvation on the mind. And when I say starvation, the study that I'm going to share with you actually was about starvation, but we also, and you'll understand more once I tell you about the study, but we also recognize that irregular eating, purging behaviors, chronic dieting can have a similar effect as starvation on the mind. So in the 1940s, there was this study, there was an interest in understanding a little bit more about what happens to the body and mind during starvation and how do people recover after a starvation period. It was after the war. And so there was really an interest in understanding, for so many people that had inadequate nutrition during the war, what would that recovery process look like? And so they recruited some young Army men. The men were screened very thoroughly to be sure that none of them had any kind of psychiatric conditions, no mood disorders. They were all deemed to be normal, regular eaters in a normal, healthy weight range. And they were recruited for this study where first they were observed for a little while in a control condition for, I think it was about 3 months, just eating normally and relating normally with one another. And they were found to be a very hearty, happy group of guys. They would engage in lively conversations around the dinner table or the lunch table. They had broad interests. They were considered pretty socially connected. And again, no mood conditions or irregular behaviors around eating or any kind of unusual concerns around their body shape or weight. And then they were put in a control condition for a period of time where their calories were cut dramatically. I think really about in half, a 50% reduction in calories. And then as the men were kind of essentially starved, they were observed. And what they found was very soon after the starvation period began, the men began evidencing a lot of shifts in terms of their behaviors and their reported moods. So many of the men became much more isolated. Those really dynamic conversations over meals really dwindled. If anything, the men seemed much more interested in talking about food, recipes, agriculture. So very kind of food centric. They became very anxious about the meals that were served. They wanted the meals to be served on time. If meals were delayed slightly, some of the men became very distressed about that. Many of the men developed behaviors around their eating. They would move the food around more on the plate, or they would cut it up in small pieces. Some of them would extend the meal time for a long time. So they'd eat very, very slowly in order to extend the pleasurable experience of the meal. Some of the men began to gravitate toward coffee and would drink many, many cups of coffee every day. at least one of the men started chewing a ton of gum and would go through many packs of gum in one day. They increased their water completion as well, and reported beginning to feel depressed. They were isolating much more. There was a higher level of anxiety amongst the group. Some of the men became more preoccupied with their stomachs, and were their stomachs bloated, or were their stomachs concave? How many ribs did they feel? So becoming almost kind of body focused as a result of the starvation. And what this study told us really is that starvation itself can actually induce features of anorexia. So these behaviors and mood symptoms that we so often see in certain eating disorders really came about for these men because they were getting inadequate nutrition. And so what that means for treatment of eating disorders, and especially with anorexia, but we find this across all conditions, is that the most important element of treatment for a while at the beginning is really nutrition, restoring nutrition, normalizing weight. And through restored nutrition and weight stabilization, we begin to see a decrease in depressive symptoms, a decrease in anxiety, decrease in obsessive thoughts, compulsive behaviors, decrease in body-focused behaviors, body preoccupation. And without question, this is what we see in recovery. As people get better nourished, their bodies know they're going to get consistent, regular, steady nutrition. Their minds begin to restore. And so what that tells us also is just how important nutrition is going to be at the beginning, especially at the beginning of a treatment process. Restoring a regular eating pattern, increasing the variety of food and the quantity of food to be sure that individual is getting what they need. Jen, I'm curious, do you share that study?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
All the time.
And oftentimes I think people are very relieved actually to hear it. It's very reassuring, because so often people with eating disorders are so completely focused on food, wanting to think about their food, look at food, prepare food, even if they're not going to eat the food. There is without question a food focus, and that is not because there's something wrong with them. It's most likely because their brains are not getting the regular nutrition that they need. So it can be really helpful for people to understand that they're not weird. There's nothing wrong with that preoccupation. It's really not at all surprising, especially in somebody that might be weight suppressed. We will expect there to be a complete food focus, right?
Yes, 100%.
So I think what that really tells us is that wherever you are and wherever you are in the treatment process, we always want to think about going back to really the basics of the recovery work and the therapeutic work, which is about getting into a regular eating schedule, a consistent, predictable eating schedule, even if you're not quite working on your variety at the beginning, to really work on adequacy of your intake throughout the day.
Yeah. I've heard, therapists say about their patients, patients who say, oh, I think I have anxiety disorder. And the therapist, will say, yeah, I'm not convinced you have anxiety disorder. I think you need to weight restore first, and then we'll see if you really have anxiety disorder.
Yeah, it's really hard to properly assess and diagnose somebody who is in the midst of an eating disorder. So whether they're underweight or whether they're purging regularly, and there's that kind of disruption to the system, or periods of, starvation and then overeating, until all of those behaviors are really stabilized, it's very hard to make a proper mood diagnosis and to even think about the right psychotherapy beyond just the eating disorder work.
Yeah.
Often, we'll see this a lot with the kids and the teenagers doing family-based treatment, where essentially what you do in family-based treatment with kids and teenagers is that you create an inpatient setting at home. So parents kind of take over the feeding for a while until the child is kind of ready to eat on their own. And within that structure, you'll see, particularly with anorexia, for example, you'll see, steady weight restoration. And the parents will say, I'm noticing my kid coming back. We're 3 weeks into this. And I'm beginning to see signs of this person that was lost in the eating disorder. So it's really dramatic, actually, how that nutrition element really is so repairing, is so restorative.
I know, it's really amazing. And I'm sure, we hear parents say that all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Jen, it was so good to have you here with us today.
It's wonderful to be here.
I hope that everybody will join on Thursday. We have another guest coming on Thursday at 1:00. And feel free to check back on our website, my3square.com. You'll be able to see a calendar of guests and the times and dates of this virtual meal support. And we hope to have you back. Have a good day.
Enjoy your day, everybody.
Thanks again, Jen.
Thank you. Bye.